The alarms pierced the tranquil hum of the Galactic Council's monitoring station like a knife through silk. Red strobes ignited the room, their rhythmic flashes transforming the sleek control center into a war zone of shadow and light. Rows of holographic screens projected chaos, flashes of energy signatures, unknown ship schematics, and data streams scrolling too fast for anyone to comprehend. The faint scent of ozone from overworked consoles filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of fear. "Trajectory confirmed. Sector 9, neutral zone," barked a technician, her voice breaking under the weight of panic. Her pale, elongated fingers darted across a glowing control panel. There's no match in the database. These ships, they're nothing like anything we've seen before." Commander Rylan Kane entered the room, his boots striking the floor with a sharp, deliberate cadence. He cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered, his battle-worn uniform an uneven patchwork of faded blues and silver insignias. His cobalt eyes swept across the scene, taking in the pandemonium with a grim efficiency. The scent of burnt circuits hit his nose, subtle but unmistakable. "Get me visuals," he commanded, his voice like tempered steel. The room hushed, a stillness settling as if the air itself obeyed him. On the central screen, the feed blinked to life, and every breath in the room seemed to catch at once. The fleet stretched across the void like a swarm of predatory insects, their angular hulls radiating menace. Each ship was a fortress of matte black metal, bristling with weapons that glinted faintly against the light of distant stars. They moved with eerie precision, their formation tightening like a noose as they crept closer to the Council's borders. "How many?" Kane asked. 312 confirmed," replied Alina Taurus, the station's chief xenoscientist, stepping forward. Her voice was calm but carried the undertone of disbelief, her dark eyes, framed by delicate silver tattoos, marking her status as a scholar, locked onto the screen. "And their energy signatures? It's like nothing we've encountered. Their engines seem to defy thermodynamic laws." Kane felt his stomach tighten. The Council had faced countless threats over the decades. Pirates, insurgents, rogue AIs. But this fleet was different. Its presence was deliberate, its silence unnerving. The Council's greatest strength, its collective knowledge, had suddenly become its weakness. These ships weren't in the records. They weren't supposed to exist. "Any attempts at communication?" he asked. "Not yet," Elena answered. "They're broadcasting nothing, just moving." The sound of shifting fabric broke the moment as General Kalen Droth stepped into view. His emerald-scaled face reflected the crimson lights, his slit-pupiled eyes narrowing at the screen. "This is an act of aggression," he hissed. "We should scramble the fleet." "And fire on what, General?" Kane shot back, turning to meet the reptilian's glare. "We don't know their intent. We don't even know what they're capable of. We can't wait to find out. This isn't a diplomatic convoy. This is an invasion force. They haven't crossed the border yet." "Yet." The room buzzed with muted whispers as Council staff debated silently, their uncertainty as thick as the oppressive heat from overheating terminals. Kane clenched his jaw, unwilling to let fear dictate their next move. "Let's not start a war until we know there's one to fight," Kane said, his voice lowering to a razor-sharp edge. "Get me scans. Full spectrum. I want everything. Hull composition, propulsion systems, energy fields." The technician nodded, her trembling fingers moving across the controls. "Initiating now, sir." As the scans ran, Alina moved closer to Kane, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Rylan, something about this fleet. It feels intentional. Their positioning, their silence. It's calculated, like they're testing us." Kane's gaze didn't leave the screen. "Then let's hope we pass." A sudden chime echoed through the room, a cold, mechanical note that silenced every murmur. The main display flickered, distorted briefly, then resolved into a symbol, a stark crimson circle bisected by a jagged line. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. "They're transmitting," the technician whispered, her voice barely audible. "Put it through," Kane ordered. The symbol vanished, replaced by a single figure, a man, or at least something resembling one. His features were sharp, almost sculpted, his skin pale and taut like marble under a pale sun. His dark eyes carried an unsettling stillness, and when he spoke, his voice was deep, deliberate, and layered with an accent unfamiliar to any present. "We are the Deathworlder Fleet," he said. The name alone sent shivers down Kane's spine. "We come not as conquerors, but as seekers. We demand parley with your strongest." The message ended abruptly, the screen returning to the image of the fleet. For a long moment no one spoke, the room thick with the sound of shallow breathing and the distant hum of power systems. Droth broke the silence, his voice a growl. "Parley? This is a ploy. They're baiting us into lowering our defenses." Alina folded her arms, her expression thoughtful. "Or they're testing us, as I said. A fleet like that could obliterate this station without a second thought. Why ask for parley if conquest is their goal?" "To toy with us," Droth spat. "Predators enjoy watching their prey squirm." Kane turned to the technician. "Run that message through all language algorithms. I want to be sure we're not missing context." "It's already been decoded, sir," she said. "The transmission was remarkably simple, almost as if—" "They wanted us to understand," Alina finished, her tone heavy with implication. Kane straightened, the weight of command settling across his shoulders. He spoke to the room, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Prep the council chamber for an emergency session. I want all representatives briefed within the hour, and alert the fleet to maintain a defensive perimeter. No engagement unless I give the order." Droth hissed in frustration, but didn't argue further. He stalked from the room, his claws clicking against the floor with every step. Kane watched him go, his mind churning. Alina leaned closer. "What are you thinking, Commander?" "That this isn't the prelude to a battle," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ominous fleet. "It's the opening move in something much larger." As he spoke, the lights dimmed briefly, the station's systems straining under the sheer energy output of the approaching fleet. The hum of machinery deepened, a low vibration Kane could feel in his bones. He turned back to the screen, watching the silent, monolithic ships inch closer. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself were bracing for impact. The scent of ionized particles lingered, faint but sharp, a harbinger of the storm to come. Kane took a steadying breath, the copper tang of anticipation bitter on his tongue. "They want our strongest," he muttered, almost to himself. "Let's see if they can handle it." The council chamber loomed like a cathedral of light and shadow, its vaulted ceilings rippling with the faint glow of crystalline panels. Representatives from every corner of the coalition sat in curved tiers, their faces illuminated by the holographic image of the Deathworlder Fleet suspended in the center of the room. The air thrummed with muted whispers, each voice laced with unease. The usual scent of polished stone and filtered air carried an undercurrent of sweat, fear that no diplomatic posturing could conceal. Commander Rylan Kane stood at the base of the chamber, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He felt the weight of every gaze on him. To them, he was the embodiment of military control, a symbol of order in the face of chaos. Yet beneath his stoic exterior, his thoughts churned like a restless sea. The Deathworlder envoy was en route, and Kane couldn't shake the gnawing sense that this encounter would redefine everything they thought they knew about war, peace, and survival. A sudden hiss of hydraulics drew every eye to the chamber doors. They slid open with a deliberate slowness, revealing a figure framed by the cold light of the docking bay beyond. The Deathworlder stepped inside, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. He moved with calculated precision, each step heavy against the polished floor, the sound reverberating through the hushed chamber. The envoy was human. Kane's eyes narrowed as he took in the figure. The man was tall but not towering, his frame compact with coiled strength. His uniform was dark, functional, and devoid of ornamentation, a stark contrast to the ornate robes favored by the council. His face was sharp and angular, his dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made even seasoned representatives shift uneasily in their seats. His skin bore the faintest hint of weathering, as if it had been forged in harsh winds and unrelenting sun. "Commander Rylan Kane," the man said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken intentions. "I am Captain Lyrian Valak, representative of the Deathworlder Fleet." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the soft hum of the chamber's environmental systems seemed to fade, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "You requested parley," Kane replied, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "We've granted it. Speak." Valak's gaze flicked to the holographic fleet above, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You misunderstand, Commander. Parley was not a request. It was a courtesy." A ripple of indignation swept through the chamber. Kane's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. He met Valak's gaze head-on, searching for cracks in the man's composure, for any hint of arrogance or malice. Instead, he found something far more unsettling. Calm, absolute, unshakable calm. "What does your fleet want?" Kane pressed, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a razor. "Why have you come here?" Valak turned his attention to the assembled council, his dark eyes sweeping over them like a predator surveying its prey. "We have come because the galaxy is changing. Forces older and stronger than you can imagine are stirring, and your coalition is woefully unprepared. We have seen their destruction firsthand. Entire systems burned to ash, civilizations erased." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The holographic fleet flickered above them, a silent reminder of the power that had arrived on their doorstep. "Who are they?" a representative asked, her voice trembling. "They call themselves the Arbiter Armada," Valak replied. "But they are not conquerors. They are eradicators. They do not negotiate. They do not reason. They consume." Kane's mind raced. He had read reports of ancient threats buried in the archives, vague whispers of fleets that moved like ghosts through the void, leaving only silence in their wake. But the Arbiter Armada had always been dismissed as myth, a cautionary tale to justify the Council's militarization. And yet, here stood a man who spoke of them with the certainty of someone who had faced their wrath. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" General Kalen Droth interjected, his scaled tail whipping against the floor. "For all we know, this is a fabrication to force us into submission." Valak's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous timbre. "Submission? If submission were our goal, your ships would already be debris. We came here to offer an alliance, not a conquest. But if you refuse to listen, if you choose to bury your heads in the sand, then the Arbiter Armada will bury you with them." The room erupted into chaos, voices clashing in a cacophony of fear and defiance. Kane stepped forward, his presence cutting through the noise like a gale. "Enough!" he barked. The chamber fell silent, all eyes turning to him. He turned to Valak, his tone measured but firm. "You speak of an alliance. What exactly are you offering?" "Strength," Valak said simply. "Our ships, our soldiers, our technology. We have spent decades preparing for the armadas. We know their tactics, their weaknesses. We have fought them and survived. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Kane felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. The Council was strong, yes, but they had grown complacent in their strength. Their wars had been skirmishes, their enemies scattered and disorganized. They had never faced an existential threat. "And what do you want in return?" Kane asked. Valak's gaze locked onto his, unflinching. "We want unity. We want your fleets, your knowledge, your resources. Together we can stop the armadas before they reach your core worlds. But divided..." He let the word hang, unfinished, its implication as clear as a blade at their throats. Kane studied the man, his instincts screaming for caution. Valak's words carried the ring of truth, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken. He could see it in the way the man held himself, in the faint tension at the edges of his jaw. Valak was holding back, and Kane intended to find out why. "Very well," Kane said finally. "We will consider your proposal, but until we do, your fleet will remain at the border. Any unauthorized movements, any signs of aggression, and this parley is over." "Understood," Valak said, inclining his head. "But do not take too long to decide, Commander. The Arbiter Armada does not wait. With that, he turned and strode from the chamber, his presence lingering like a storm cloud. As the doors hissed shut behind him, Kane exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He could still feel the faint vibration of Valak's footsteps in the floor, like the echo of an approaching reckoning. "We can't trust them," Droth growled. "They're using us." "Maybe," Kane said, his gaze fixed on the holographic fleet above. "Or maybe they're the only chance we have." The tactical chamber buzzed with tension, a current of urgency running beneath every clipped command and rapid keystroke. The holographic table in the center of the room projected a rotating image of the Arbiter Vanguard, a dark, angular swarm against the pale expanse of the neutral zone. Each ship shimmered with unreadable power signatures, their movements too precise, too deliberate. The air smelled faintly of burnt circuitry, a reminder of the Council's aging systems struggling to process the incomprehensible data. Commander Rylan Kane stood at the head of the table, his jaw set as he scanned the reports scrolling past on a smaller display. His shoulders ached from hours of tension, but he refused to give in to fatigue. Around him, the Council's top strategists murmured in subdued tones, their voices betraying unease despite their best attempts at composure. General Droth paced nearby, his clawed feet tapping a restless rhythm against the metal floor. At Kane's side, Captain Lyrian Valak observed silently, his posture calm but alert, like a predator waiting to pounce. The dim light of the hologram cast sharp shadows across his face, deepening the unsettling intensity of his gaze. "They're moving faster than anticipated," Kane said, breaking the quiet. His voice carried the weight of frustration, his fingers brushing against the edge of the console, as if grounding himself. "The Arbiter Vanguard will reach Velis Prime within 40 hours. "That's assuming they don't accelerate further," Elena Taurus added. She stood on the far side of the table, her sharp features framed by the cool glow of data streams. "Their propulsion systems are still an enigma. Every time we think we've predicted their limits, they surpass them." General Droth's tail lashed the air, the movement a whip crack of irritation. "Then we should hit them now, while they're still in transit. Waiting only gives them more time to solidify their position." "And waste what little advantage we have?" Valak interjected, his tone cutting through the conversation like a scalpel. His dark eyes met Droth's, unblinking. "If you attack now with half-baked plans, you'll lose every ship you send. The Arbiters don't need time to solidify. They already have it. They've been perfecting their war machine for millennia." The general's scales flushed a deep crimson, but Kane raised a hand before he could respond. "Enough. We're not here to trade barbs. We're here to figure out how to survive." The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Kane turned back to the hologram, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of Valak's presence beside him, an unspoken challenge that pushed him to think harder, faster. "We don't have the numbers to confront them head-on," Kane said, his voice steady but grim. "Even with your fleet captain, we'd be outgunned. We need to outmaneuver them." Valak tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And how do you propose to outmaneuver an enemy that doesn't falter, that doesn't retreat?" "By making them think we're stronger than we are," Kane replied, his tone sharper now, each word a blade. He gestured to the hologram, drawing a line across the Arbiter's projected path. "We use decoys, small cloaked drones designed to mimic the energy signatures of our largest ships. They'll lead the Vanguard into a trap." "And what happens when the trap is sprung?" Valak asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge of challenge. "Your decoys will buy you time, but it won't be enough. The Arbiters will adapt." "That's where you come in," Kane said, turning to face him fully. "Your fleet is designed to take hits ours can't. You'll hold the line while we deploy an EMP weapon to disrupt their coordination. Without their precision, their formation will falter." Valak's gaze narrowed, his expression thoughtful. "An EMP? That's a gamble. If it fails—" "It won't," Elena interrupted, her voice firm. She stepped closer, her sharp eyes meeting Valak's. "The prototype is untested, yes, but the science is sound. It emits a pulse tuned to the frequency of their command systems. It'll work." Valak studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but we'll need a fallback plan. Kane exhaled, his mind already moving to the next step. We'll have strike teams on standby. If the EMP fails, they'll target key Arbiter ships directly. Small, fast units equipped with shield-piercing charges. Droth's tail flicked again, but this time his tone was less hostile. You're talking about coordinated sabotage. Risky, but it might work. Risk is all we've got left, Kane said. He turned back to the table, his fingers moving across the controls as he brought up a new projection, a simulation of the plan in action. We're not going to win this fight by playing it safe. For a moment the room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Valak spoke, his voice low but resolute. If this is the path we're taking, then my fleet will lead the charge. We're not strangers to high-risk scenarios. And what do you gain from all this, Captain? Kane asked, his tone laced with suspicion. You've painted yourselves as allies, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to your presence here. Valak's gaze didn't waver. What we gain is survival. The Arbiters are a threat to all of us. If we fall, you fall. If you fall, we're next. We don't have the luxury of ulterior motives, Commander. We fight because there's no other choice. The words hung heavy in the air, their raw honesty difficult to dispute. Kane nodded slowly, though the knot of unease in his chest remained. Then we're in agreement, Kane said finally. He looked around the room, meeting each gaze in turn. We have 40 hours. Let's make them count. As the strategists dispersed, the room's hum settled into a quieter rhythm. Kane remained by the table, his thoughts a storm of contingencies and doubts. He felt Elena step up beside him, her presence a steadying force. You don't trust him, she said softly. Would you? Kane replied, his voice low. No, she admitted. But that doesn't mean he's wrong. Kane sighed, his eyes fixed on the hologram of the Arbiter Fleet. I just hope we're not walking into something we can't walk out of. As Valak left the chamber, his expression gave nothing away. But in the dark corners of his mind, he carried a secret. A truth that could shift the balance of the coming battle. He glanced over his shoulder once, his gaze lingering on Kane, before disappearing into the shadowed corridors beyond. The countdown to Velis Prime had begun, and every second carried the weight of a galaxy teetering on the edge of annihilation. The skies above Velis Prime burned with fire and fury. The Arbiter vanguard descended like a swarm of metallic locusts, their angular forms reflecting the dying light of the system's twin suns. Energy beams lanced from their ranks, illuminating the dark void with violent bursts of green and gold. Below, the city sprawled in fragile defiance, its alabaster towers trembling as distant explosions rippled through the atmosphere. The faint tang of ionized air reached even the fortified command center, where Commander Rylan Kane stood surrounded by a sea of glowing tactical displays. All units, report! Kane barked, his voice slicing through the cacophony of overlapping chatter. The air in the command room was stifling, heavy with the metallic scent of machinery and the acrid sting of stress. Decoy drones are holding formation, Elena Torres reported, her fingers flying over the console as data streamed past in frenetic waves. The tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm tone. The Arbiters are engaging the false signals as expected. Good, Kane muttered. He leaned over the holographic table, his eyes narrowing as he traced the movements of the enemy fleet. Each red marker was a dagger poised over Velis Prime's fragile heart. Let's keep them focused. Don't give them a reason to doubt. Outside the planet's atmosphere, the Deathworlder Fleet surged forward. Valak's flagship, a towering beast of blackened steel and thrumming engines, led the charge. The ship's hull bore the scars of countless battles, its surface a patchwork of repairs and reinforcements. Flanking it were smaller vessels, each designed with brutal efficiency, thick armor plating, projectile weaponry that defied conventional wisdom, and engines that roared like beasts unleashed. In the flagship's command deck, Captain Valak stood with his arms crossed, his dark eyes locked on the tactical display. Maintain the wedge formation, he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding. Push through their outer line and hold. Our job is to keep them occupied long enough for Kane to deploy his weapon. His first officer, a wiry woman with a sharp gaze, glanced at him. And if the EMP doesn't work? Valak's lips curved into a faint smile. Then we improvise. The Deathworlder ships collided with the Arbiter Fleet in a thunderous exchange of firepower. The Arbiter's energy beams slammed into their armored hulls, scorching the reinforced plating but failing to penetrate. In return, the Deathworlders unleashed a torrent of kinetic projectiles, each strike shaking the Arbiter ships with the force of a meteor impact. The sound of distant impacts reverberated through Valak's ship, a low, bone-deep rumble. Back in the command center on Velis Prime, Kane watched the battle unfold with a mixture of awe and unease. The Deathworlders were holding the line, but the Arbiter Fleet's numbers were overwhelming. The decoy drones had drawn part of the vanguard away, but the rest were pressing hard against Valak's forces. "How long until the EMP is ready?" Kane demanded. 5 minutes, Elena replied, her voice strained. "But we've got a problem. The Arbiters are starting to shift their formation. They're adapting faster than we anticipated." Kane's fist clenched. Of course they were. The Arbiters were more than machines. They were predators, programmed to hunt and destroy with merciless precision. "We need to keep them distracted," he said, his mind racing. "Signal Valak. Tell him to draw their fire toward the northern hemisphere. It'll buy us time." Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Relaying now." The next few moments felt like an eternity. The command center buzzed with frenetic energy, the distant booms of orbital strikes vibrating through the walls. Kane's ears caught the faint crackle of overloaded comm channels, the voices of pilots shouting orders and warnings before fading into static. The room smelled of sweat and stress, the air growing thicker with every passing second. "EMP charged and ready," Elena announced, her voice cutting through the noise like a lifeline. "Coordinates locked." "Deploy it," Kane ordered. "Now." High above the planet, a sleek council ship broke formation, its engines flaring as it dove toward the heart of the Arbiter Fleet. The EMP device was mounted on its undercarriage, glowing faintly with a menacing blue light. The ship weaved through the chaos, dodging energy blasts with surgical precision, its pilot's steady breaths audible over the comms. "Final approach," the pilot said, his voice steady despite the gravity of his mission. "Engaging release mechanism in 3, 2. The EMP detonated with a silent, blinding burst. A ripple of blue energy cascaded outward, washing over the Arbiter Fleet like an unstoppable tide. For a moment the battlefield seemed to freeze. The Arbiter ships shuddered, their lights flickering as the pulse scrambled their systems. Kane held his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Status?" he demanded. "It's working," Elena said, relief flooding her voice. "Their coordination is breaking down. We're seeing disruptions across their entire formation." Kane exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening. "Relay the signal to all units. Press the advantage. Hit them hard before they recover." Valak's fleet surged forward with renewed ferocity, their weapons tearing into the disoriented Arbiter ships. The Deathworlders moved like a pack of wolves, isolating stragglers and dismantling them piece by piece. On the surface, Council artillery joined the fray, their energy cannons firing in synchronized bursts that lit up the night sky. But the victory was short-lived. "Commander," Elena said, her voice sharp with urgency, "we've got incoming. More signatures on the outer edge of the system. It's the main fleet." Kane's stomach dropped as a new wave of red markers flooded the holographic display. The Arbiter reinforcements dwarfed the vanguard, their sheer numbers casting a shadow over the fragile hope they had just kindled. "Valak," Kane called over the comms, his voice tight. "We've got a problem. The main fleet just entered the system." On the flagship, Valak's jaw tightened. He stared at the tactical display, his mind a storm of calculations and contingencies. "Then we don't retreat," he said finally. "We hold the line." Kane's grip on the console tightened, his knuckles white. "If you hold that line, your fleet will be wiped out. And if we retreat, they'll tear through Velis Prime like a wildfire," Valak countered, his voice hard. "We don't have the luxury of survival, Commander. We fight. Kane's throat tightened, the weight of Valak's words settling over him like a shroud. He turned to Alina, his mind racing. Start evacuating non-combat personnel. We may not have another chance. The battle raged on, each second a desperate struggle against an overwhelming tide. The Deathworlders fought with brutal efficiency, their ships hammering the Arbiter reinforcements with relentless ferocity. But the odds were impossible, and even their unyielding strength began to falter. In the command center, Kane watched in grim silence as the holographic display filled with red. The air around him seemed colder now, the faint scent of burnt circuitry more pronounced. He felt the weight of every life lost, every sacrifice made to buy them just a few more moments. "Hold the line," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Just a little longer." The command center quaked as another Arbiter blast slammed into the planet's surface, shaking the reinforced walls and rattling loose equipment. The faint tang of scorched metal filled the air, mingling with the acrid scent of desperation. Alarms blared, their shrill cries weaving into the cacophony of frantic orders and the low hum of the holographic tactical display. The red wave of the Arbiter reinforcements now covered the screen like blood pooling in water. Commander Rylan Kane stood at the center of the chaos, his expression carved from stone. His cobalt eyes flicked from one screen to the next, absorbing every grim update. The Deathworlders were holding the line, but their fleet was battered, their ranks thinning under the relentless onslaught. A low murmur of static buzzed in his earpiece before Captain Lyrian Valak's voice came through, sharp and unyielding. "We're taking heavy losses, Kane," Valak said. "Your window to act is closing fast." Kane's jaw tightened. "You've bought us time. Just hold them a little longer." "That's all we've got left, a little," Valak replied. Despite the weight of his words, his tone carried no fear, only certainty. "Don't waste it." Kane turned to Alina Taurus, who was frantically coordinating the evacuation efforts. Her dark eyes flashed with determination as she relayed orders to the ground teams. The air around her crackled with tension, as if her focus alone could keep the world from crumbling. "Status on the evacuation?" Kane asked. 30% complete, she replied without looking up. "We're running out of transports, and the Arbiters are closing in too fast." Kane exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to retreat, to save what they could and abandon the rest. But the image of Valak's fleet, those blackened ships tearing through the Arbiter lines with reckless courage, burned in his mind. They hadn't come to retreat, they had come to fight. "Prepare the final contingency," Kane said, his voice low but resolute. Alina froze, her hands hovering over the console as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "You can't be serious," she said, turning to face him. "If we detonate the core, we'll lose the entire city." "And we'll take the Arbiters with us," Kane replied. His voice was calm, but the faint tremor in his jaw betrayed the weight of the decision. Velis Prime was never the endgame. It's a message. If we show the Arbiters what we're willing to sacrifice, maybe they'll think twice before pressing further. Alina's gaze hardened, but she didn't argue. "I'll need authorization codes from the Council." "Let me handle them," Kane said, striding toward the comm terminal. The cold metal of the interface felt unyielding under his palm as he opened a direct channel to the Council chamber. The holographic image of General Kalen Droth flickered to life, his scaled face twisted with barely restrained anger. "Kane, what is the meaning of this? You're asking us to destroy one of our most valuable colonies." "I'm asking you to save the galaxy," Kane shot back. "The Arbiters are relentless. If we don't make this stand here and now, they'll march through every system in their path. Velis Prime is already lost, General, but its sacrifice can buy us the future." Droth's tail lashed behind him, the motion betraying his inner conflict. "And what of the people still on the surface?" "They're being evacuated," Kane said. "But not all of them will make it. That's the reality we're facing. The Deathworlders didn't hesitate to throw everything they had into this fight. It's time we did the same." Droth fell silent, his slit-pupilled eyes narrowing as he studied Kane. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he inclined his head. "You have my authorization. Do what must be done." Kane closed the channel and turned back to Alina, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. Activate the detonation sequence. As Alina began inputting the codes, Kane opened another channel, this one to Valak. The captain's face appeared on the screen, his dark eyes burning with intensity. "Valak," Kane said, his voice tight, "we're detonating the planetary core. You need to pull your fleet back." For the first time, Valak's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. Then he nodded. "Understood. We'll give you as much cover as we can." "And Valak," Kane added, his voice softening. "Thank you. For everything." Valak smirked, a faint, grim curve of his lips. "Don't thank me yet, Kane. Survive first." The connection cut, and Kane turned to the tactical display. The evacuation ships were scrambling to escape the planet's gravity well, their engines blazing against the darkness. Above them, the Deathworlder Fleet continued to fight with brutal tenacity, their battered ships drawing the Arbiter forces into the kill zone. "Detonation sequence initiated," Alina announced. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she stepped back from the console. Kane stared at the countdown ticking down on the screen. 10 minutes. Each second felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest like a physical force. He could hear the faint hum of the core's activation, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to echo through the very bones of the planet. Outside, the battle raged on. Valak's flagship bore down on an Arbiter command vessel, its kinetic weapons tearing through the enemy's hull with savage precision. The ship shuddered under the force of the Arbiter's retaliation, but it held firm, its engines roaring as it delivered one final devastating blow. The Arbiter ship erupted in a blinding cascade of fire and debris, its remains scattering across the void. Valak's voice crackled over the comms. "Kane, we're pulling back. Don't miss your mark." "Understood," Kane replied. He turned to Alina, his voice sharp. "Get the last transports out now. We're almost out of time." As the final ships broke through the atmosphere, Kane felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The core's activation was reaching its peak, the energy building to a crescendo that would obliterate everything in its path. He took a deep breath, the acrid air stinging his lungs, and closed his eyes for a moment. When the countdown reached 0, the world seemed to pause. There was no sound, no movement, only an unbearable stillness. Then, with a deafening roar, the core detonated. A blinding wave of energy surged outward, consuming the Arbiter fleet in an instant. The light was so intense it turned night to day, casting long shadows across the fleeing transports. On the Deathworlder flagship, Valak watched the explosion from the safety of the retreating fleet. His face was illuminated by the searing light, his expression unreadable. "They'll remember this," he murmured. "They'll remember what we're capable of." In the command center, Kane stood silently, his gaze fixed on the tactical display as it flickered and died. The air was heavy with the weight of loss and victory intertwined. Alina stepped beside him, her voice soft. "They'll come back," she said. "The Arbiters always come back." Kane nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then so will we." As the remaining ships regrouped in the silence of the void, the image of Velis Prime's sacrifice burned into the minds of all who had witnessed it. The Deathworlder fleet had changed everything, not through conquest, but by showing the galaxy what it truly meant to fight for survival. They had turned death into defiance, destruction into hope, and as Kane stared into the endless expanse of stars, he knew that humanity's legacy would be written in fire and remembered in awe.